Welcome to RenMac Off Script, where we discuss markets, economics, policy, history, and life. It is the 1st of March, 2024. I'm Jeff DeGraff.
I'm Neil Dutta.
And I'm Steve Pavlik.
As a reminder, most of the charts that we reference are posted to our Twitter and our LinkedIn page, RenMac LLC, and our RenMac LinkedIn page. We're going to talk about today inflation, the government shutdown, aversion, at least temporarily, what's happening to market internals, and of course, the battle between momentum and beta. Let's start with you, Neil. We had inflation numbers this week. Seems like they were, at least from a market's perspective, a little bit more helpful to the doves. What was your take on this?
Well, I wouldn't say that they're helpful for the doves. I would just say that the markets were anticipating, the higher end of consensus, and we didn't get that, right? So it kind of came in right in line with expectations. We were sort of primed for a firm number after the CPI and the producer price data, and it basically came in right on the nose. And so I think what you saw was basically a relief rally in the market reaction to the number. I think a lot of the commentary that's out there right now is very much taking the last inflation number and just sort of running with it, right? So there was, there's some chatter that maybe the Fed's next move is a hike. Maybe they're not going to cut it all this year. And I think you want to be very careful with sort of buying into those narratives. I mean, I don't think that we should be fundamentally changing our views based on one data point in January, which is notoriously a very weird month for inflation. You always have to kind of stick with first principles. And, what's more likely, that inflation is sort of reaccelerating at a time when inflation expectations are still slowing, where the labor markets are still normalizing, or not. And my thing is, let's stick with the first principles, right? I mean, if inflation, unit labor costs are low because compensation, is moderating and productivity's picked up, then it's really hard to see why inflation is going to take off here. There's still a pipeline of disinflation in front of us. And I think it's important not to lose sight of that. Now, it is encouraging that people kind of see the stronger economy, but I think that doesn't necessarily linearly map to inflation. It's not like, oh, the economy is growing above trend in January and February, therefore inflation will be firmer in March and April. Like, that's not how it works. And so, inflation is a process, particularly slow-moving one at that, especially outside of commodities. And, the things that we see, don't really lead me to believe that that we should be fundamentally altering our opinions on the inflation outlook right now.
So did that keep May in play for you?
Yeah, it does. I mean, at a minimum, May is underpriced in my book. I mean, I could easily see a scenario where March and April are coming in a little bit lower than expectations. And May could be game on again, right? I mean, so it's just, I think people are very hypersensitive to inflation at the moment. They're looking for signs of inflation acceleration. Okay, I get it. It's important to kind of think about those scenarios, but has the baseline really changed? I don't think that it has. I think the economy is growing. It's growing at a solid pace, but I don't think inflation is accelerating in any meaningful sense.
Yeah. Well, in terms of what happened in Washington this week, you, Steve Pavlik, do not see that as really any Herculean accomplishment. Obviously averting a shutdown, but just temporarily. What's your take on what's going on there and what's happening generally?
Well, I think the government shutdown really wasn't an interest to either side. What we just see right now is, to your point, just this lower bar, which it's hard to get any lower. We're cheering, just kicking the can further and further down the road. I mean, the new fiscal year began on October 1st. Here we are on March 1st. I mean, at some point, like, why not just continue through the rest of the year, which is what I think some conservatives are going to push for, because there is this provision going back to the agreement reached by Biden and then Speaker McCarthy for 1% sequestration cut that would kick in after April 30th. Now, obviously, Democrats and national security hawks aren't really going to like that. So whether Johnson can continue to sort of kick this can down the road, maybe get to that desired outcome, at least from fiscal conservatives' perspective, that's something to watch. Because if Johnson doesn't have any policy wins to point to included in these bills, that may be where he's pushed to go. Now, the 1% sequestration cut is very different than what I think saw 2012 when there was a massive sequestration cut, which I believe people worried that would take some of the fiscal stimulus out and would be a drag on the economy. I don't think it's a surprise or coincidence that you had the Biden administration unveiling a lot of the stimulus from previously passed bills, be it the uh, American Rescue Plan when they first got into office, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really energy stimulus credits, the CHIPS Act for the semiconductors. I think that's really meant to continue to try to prevent the economy from slowing into an election year, which is just good politics. So I don't really see any fiscal drag in the near term this year. Now, that said, a lot of that money is probably going to be awarded prior to November. So it'll be interesting to see what that means next year, depending on the congressional outcome. But the election outcome in general could be very interesting. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about it.
And what was the kind of takeaway this last week? We had Michigan, right? Was there any messaging sent from either camp, Republicans or Democrats, to the current candidates?
I think there's reasons for concern, I guess, on both sides. I don't know that the results were really that surprising. You still have some concern amongst Republican voters with respect to Trump. The question is, how many of them are going to come back for him when he's eventually the nominee? Ordinarily, in a contested primary, that's not that surprising. People eventually sort of rally around the candidate. Trump's sort of unique in a lot of ways this time around. So whether or not he can bring all these people back into the tent, something remains to be seen. And similarly for Joe Biden, you had, I think, over 100,000 people vote against him in the primary there, just on primarily on the issue of support for in Gaza, trying to get him to change that. Are they necessarily going to vote for Trump? As we discussed last week, given his Muslim ban, probably not. But do they stay home? And I think that's sort of the thing to watch, there. Just in terms of those margins, Trump won Michigan by 10,000 in 2016. Biden won Michigan by 150,000 in 2020. So that's not an insignificant number.
Right, indeed. And what else happened last week in terms of Haley's still in? The expectations are that she stays in. Where are we on?
I think the big thing was that she lost support from the Koch brothers. That was a big financial backing. We said before, we'll say again, that campaigns tend to end not on lack of ambition, but more of a lack of financial resources. So, will she have the ability to sustain money after Super Tuesday? She's even suggested herself that that's sort of an important day. Still trying to figure out what her goal is here in the sense, does she think she have a future in the Republican Party? I think if you look when she drops out, presumably, is she going to endorse Trump, try to get back into his good graces? I don't think she's going to be considered for vice president. Does she sort of, feel that's important to preserve her 28 prospects within the Republican Party? Or does she simply ditch the Republican Party and go to the no labels who needs a candidate after being spurned by Joe Manchin, a Democrat from West Virginia, Larry Hogan, Republican from Maryland? What Haley is saying and how she's acting now is what you would expect if somebody were going to entertain that option. I don't know that that's likely, but wouldn't necessarily surprise me if we saw no labels Nikki shirts, shortly after Tuesday.
Well, I hope they make it in large. The markets, in terms of momentum and beta, there's kind of this fight going on here. They have a beta performance is the 96th percentile, so very susceptible to some mean reversion. We've talked about the optionality and the buyer's frenzy indications that we've seen and still are, resonating, and I think are important, particularly tactically for market participants over the next month to maybe 3 months. But you tend to get some softening when there's that much enthusiasm along with momentum. The good news is overall momentum, that's just for those specific stocks. Overall momentum for the markets is in the 87th percentile. Again, we start getting uncomfortable as we get through that 90th percentile. But really the vulnerability in our view seems to be from the beta camp, not from the momentum camp here. 20-day highs did pick up last week. 20-day highs hit their highest level in the year to date, and that's good confirmation. That tends to give you a longer fuse on the burn for the bull market. So we like to see that. I know it's been a little bit sloppy, but we have seen the Russell 2000 try to break out here. The microcap index starting to improve on an absolute basis, not on a relative basis yet, but certainly they're doing the work that we would expect or want to see out of these indices in an overall bull market. And again, I think one thing that gets underplayed is just how important and how firm these global indices are. Europe, Japan, China's bouncing, looks more like a bounce, but still not overbought yet. I still think there's something there from the capitulation signal back about a month ago. So still think that we're in a relatively good shape. Do want to see these yields start to stabilize and come down. I'd love to see us under 4%. I think that's going to be very, very helpful as we go, but those are going to be the things that obviously we're watching and how we're playing this here. Still seeing relative weakness out of utilities, relative weakness out of staples. Healthcare, as you know, has picked up, and we do like that area. But overall, that message of pro-cyclicality versus defense is certainly still in play. Neil, what do you have next week in terms of data?
Well, first we have the ISM coming out later today.
Mm.
That'll be at 10 o'clock, so after our podcast is over. But what we see globally shows things picking up in the manufacturing space. We know that manufactured goods are tradable, which is why manufacturing is a very synchronized sector globally. But if you look at Brazil, Russia, India, China, even Europe's periphery, manufacturing PMIs are generally in expansion territory. Germany is really the sick man of Europe, sick man of the world right now. So we'll be keeping an eye on manufacturing. And then next Friday, we have the jobs number. Remember, January was a very fluky month. We had a lot of people off the job because of weather. And that probably depressed the work week to some extent. So I'm looking for, and I think the consensus is as well, just some kind of, reshifting, a rebalancing from month to month. So you'd expect to see a bit of a slower employment growth, but the work week should tick up. And you also should expect to see hourly earnings moderate somewhat. Because if the work week is going up, then the idea is that mechanically hourly earnings should moderate. So we're still generating relatively strong growth in income in the aggregate when you take jobs, hours, and hourly earnings. But it's about that mix shift for February. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. Certainly I don't think the labor markets are nearly as dire as a lot of these layoff announcements are making them out to be. I mean, there's obviously we get news about layoff announcements. I think that's more seasonal than anything else. When you look at things like jobless claims, you do see that firings haven't really ticked up all that much. So the main event next week is going to be the employment data.
Steve, how about Washington?
Well, we hit on Super Tuesday. I don't think there's really much to take there other than watching how Haley leaves. I'd watch some of the congressional primaries because that, particularly on the Republican side, could be important in terms of their chances of retaking the Senate. I would look at next Friday. That's the next government funding that just basically got punted from this Friday. But really, what I'm watching next week is Thursday. That's the State of the Union. Now, usually that's not that interesting of an event, to be honest. But I think it's taken on added significance this time because I believe there's going to be a lot of attention paid to Joe Biden's delivery. And really, does he have an opportunity there to try to push back a lot of concerns about his age and cognitive ability? He had his physical this week, and when asked whether or not he had a cognitive test, the White House press secretary said his doctor didn't recommend it. Now, if I were the White House chief of staff, I would have recommended one just to try to have that to push back against this narrative. But we are where we are. And I think that's particularly concerning because you had another Bloomberg Morning Consult poll, these monthly polls that come out in the battleground states, showing, he continues to trail Trump in all of them. And obviously looking for something to, change the direction of that poll. I think right now they're still searching for that.
Oh, I would just
Yeah.
add one thing, Jeff, quickly, on the State of the Union. Before that same day, next Thursday, Powell is going to be talking before the Senate Banking Committee. So it looks like that, the semi-annual policy testimony. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that, see if he says anything. Usually those are not the venues for, changing policy or anything like that. They don't really set the table. at those things. I mean, because the Fed is a consensus building institution, so typically those things happen at the meeting. But you have the semi-annual testimony next week, and then of course we have a March meeting a few weeks after that.
Yeah, that meeting always gives you the opportunity to see just how little the elected officials know about banking and the world of high finance. So that is always fun to watch. Well, we'll be watching key levels. 4,800, 4,600 are on the S&P. We're still in an uptrend, so that's important. Rising or ascending 50-day and 200-day, all that's good news. The only point that we start to fight the tape is when momentum is dominant. And certainly it's working, but it's not dominant yet, in our opinion. Few select areas that we've mentioned, clients know those names. We've mentioned them in the Monday morning meeting that we're obviously looking for some type of consolidation on, just given that buyer's frenzy. But that leaves, roughly 475 other names that still look pretty good. Join us again next week. We'll be 1 week older, 1 week wiser. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and RenMac.com for the charts and references. And of course, the disclaimers. That's important too, the disclaimers. Until then, I'm Jeff DeGraff.
I'm Neil Dutta.
And I'm Steve Pavlik.
We'll see you.